granddaughters abandon their grandfather in a terrible nursing home. He escapes and, upon reaching a church, makes an emotional plea to God. A true miracle happens. George, a 75-year-old man, had always led a quiet life in a small town. With a serene appearance, his gray hair and tired eyes still held a spark of life. His granddaughters, Anna and Clara, promised to take care of him, assuring him that he would never be alone. With his health failing, George was convinced by his granddaughters to move into a nursing home. They assured him that they would visit regularly and take care of his well-being. On the day of the move, Anna, trying to hide her anxiety, said, "Grandpa, you'll like the nursing home. It's a very nice place, full of people to talk to." George looked at her with a mixture of hope and apprehension, asking, "Do you promise to visit me often?" Clara, trying to appear confident, replied, "Of course, Grandpa. We would never leave you alone." George sighed, accepting his granddaughter's decision. He knew his health no longer allowed him to live alone, and trusted that the girls would keep their promise to visit him regularly. However, his heart was heavy with the thought of leaving the home where he had spent his entire life. As he prepared for the move, George felt conflicted. He didn't want to be a burden to his granddaughters, who had their own lives and responsibilities. He felt guilty for causing them trouble, while at the same time, a deep loneliness and sense of abandonment began to take hold of his heart. "Am I really becoming a burden?" he wondered as he packed his few belongings. Upon arriving at the nursing home, George looked around carefully. It was indeed beautiful, but he couldn't shake the sadness of saying goodbye to his home. His granddaughters helped him settle in and promised to return soon to visit him. "We'll be back this weekend, Grandpa," said Anna, giving him a tight hug. George smiled, but inside, he felt increasingly alone. As the days passed, he tried to get used to the new routine and make friends at the nursing home, but the longing for his family and home was a constant burden. The first days at the nursing home were lonely. George spent his time looking out the window, waiting for the promised visit from his granddaughters. Each weekend, he waited anxiously for Anna and Clara, but the days passed and they didn't show up. His heart, once full of hope, began to fill with doubt and fear. One morning, while watching the movement in the nursing home's garden, George remembered Clara's words, "We would never leave you alone." He repeated these words like a mantra, trying to find comfort in them. However, reality began to set in, and the promise seemed increasingly distant. After a few days, George began to realize the harsh reality of the nursing home. The promise of care and regular visits quickly faded. His granddaughters, Anna and Clara, never returned to see him, and when he asked the nursing home to call them, his calls went unanswered. The loneliness and abandonment weighed even more heavily on his heart. In the nursing home, George was constantly neglected. The meals were sparse and often poorly prepared. The staff's lack of attention was evident. George's basic needs, such as medication, were ignored. One day, he approached a staff member, his voice trembling, and pleaded, "Please, I need help with my medication." The staff member, without even looking at him, rudely replied, "Wait your turn, old man. We have other priorities." George felt a lump in his throat. The disdain in the staff member's words cut deep. He felt betrayed by his granddaughters and helpless. Each passing day, the deep sadness and loneliness intensified. He spent hours in his room, looking out the window, hoping to see his granddaughters walking through the nursing home gate. But this hope turned into disillusionment day after day. The other residents of the nursing home also shared their stories of abandonment and neglect. George saw himself reflected in them, each with their own battle against loneliness and neglect. How could this happen? He constantly wondered, trying to make sense of what he was experiencing. The days turned into weeks, and the sense of abandonment deepened. George couldn't understand how his granddaughters, who promised to take care of him, could have disappeared from his life so abruptly. He felt guilty, wondering if he had done something wrong to deserve such indifference. On a particularly cold morning, George felt a sharp pain in his chest. The emotional anguish seemed to manifest physically. He tried to call a staff member, but was ignored. Desperate, he got up and went to the infirmary, where he was met with disdain. "What do you want now?" asked a nurse impatiently. George, clutching his chest, replied with difficulty, "I'm feeling a strong pain. I need help." The nurse, visibly irritated, rolled her eyes and said, "Sit down and wait. I'll see what I can do." Sitting in a hard chair, George felt hot tears streaming down his face. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. He remembered the happy moments with his granddaughters, the laughter, and the promises that he would never be alone. Now, everything seemed like a distant memory, almost like a dream fading away. George, increasingly desolate due to the neglect and mistreatment at the nursing home, began to form bonds with other residents who shared their stories of abandonment and suffering. He met Martha, a woman with gray hair and eyes full of sadness, who had been left at the nursing home by her children years ago. Their friendship became a comfort amidst the daily torment. One afternoon, as the two talked in the garden, George expressed his indignation. "We don't deserve to be treated like this," he said, his voice laden with emotion. Martha, looking at the horizon, replied, "We have to find a way out. This isn't living." Martha's words resonated deeply with George. He realized that he couldn't stay there, subjected to such mistreatment. He needed to find a way to escape and regain control of his life. Over the next few days, George and Martha began planning an escape. They carefully observed the staff's movements, looking for an opportunity to leave the nursing home unnoticed. Meanwhile, other residents, seeing George's determination, started to join him. Each shared their stories, strengthening the feeling of solidarity among them. James, an elderly man with a raspy voice, recounted how his children had left him at the nursing home and never returned. Mary, a lady with a trembling gait, spoke of the pain of being forgotten by her grandchildren. Each story reinforced George's resolve to escape. "We need to be quick and discreet," George said during a secret meeting in Martha's room. "If we act together, we have a better chance of succeeding." Each day, the tension grew. The nursing home staff continued to treat them with disdain, unaware of the plan that was unfolding. Despite their fear, George and Martha remained firm in their determination. On a cold night, while everyone slept, George and Martha decided it was time to act. "Today is the day," George said, his heart pounding. Martha nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. They sneaked through the dark corridors, avoiding the few staff members who patrolled at night. When they reached the exit gate, they felt a chill run down their spines. It was now or never. With trembling hands, George tried to open the lock quietly. "Hurry, George," Martha whispered, nervously glancing around. Finally, the gate opened with a slight creak. George and Martha slipped through and ran towards freedom. As they escaped, George looked at Martha and said, "We did it. We're free." George was dropped off by the kind couple in front of his old house. Anxious and hopeful, he approached the door and rang the bell. To his surprise, when the door opened, he didn't find his granddaughters, but a couple of strangers. "What are you doing in my house?" George asked, stunned, his heart racing. The new owner, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, replied, "We bought this house. Are you all right?" George felt a mix of shock and betrayal. How could his granddaughters sell his house without his consent? He felt even more betrayed, an emptiness forming in his chest. "My granddaughters sold my house without telling me," George murmured, more to himself than to the others. Anger and pain mingled, and he felt an urgent need to understand what had happened. The couple, visibly worried about George's condition, tried to help him. "Come inside. We can talk better here," suggested the woman, trying to calm the situation. Still in shock, George was led inside the house. He looked around, recognizing some of the furniture and objects that had belonged to him. The reality of his situation began to settle in overwhelmingly. He felt disoriented and betrayed as the couple tried to explain that they had bought the house legally, unaware of the complicated situation. "We need to call someone," the man said, observing George's fragile state. "Do you have any relatives or friends we can contact?" Feeling increasingly unwell, George shook his head. The betrayal of his granddaughters and the loss of his home were too hard to bear all at once. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his chest and began to sweat. I'm not feeling well," he said weakly. The couple sprang into action. "We'll take you to the hospital right now," the man said, grabbing the phone to call an ambulance. The woman tried to keep George awake, talking to him and holding his hand. "Stay with us, George. Help is on the way," she said, trying to hide the panic in her voice. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and George was rushed to the hospital. He was conscious but weak, feeling a mix of deep sadness and anxiety. The last thing he saw before closing his eyes was the concerned faces of the couple trying to help him. At the hospital, doctors quickly assessed his condition. His blood pressure was high, and his heart was in a delicate state. He was taken to the emergency room, where he began receiving intensive care. Even amidst the chaos, George's mind couldn't stop thinking about the betrayal he had suffered. In the hospital, George was lying in bed, trying to process everything that had happened. The feeling of betrayal by his granddaughters was overwhelming. As he recovered, a social worker came to visit him. "Mr. George, we need to talk about the sale of your house," the social worker said, her face filled with concern. "There are indications that you were deceived." George looked at her, confused and anxious. "What do you mean, deceived? What happened?" The social worker held his hand with empathy. "It seems that your granddaughters used a document you signed without reading to sell your house. Do you remember signing any papers recently?" George tried to recall, but everything was a blur in his mind. I signed some papers they said were for my well-being at the nursing home. I never imagined they were deceiving me." She sighed, showing compassion. "Unfortunately, this happens more often than it should. Many elderly people end up trusting family members who, for selfish reasons, betray them." George felt the tears rolling down his face. "They sold my house? How could they do this?" he lamented, crying. The pain of betrayal was intense, and he felt devastated. The social worker tried to comfort him. "I know it's hard, Mr. George. We'll take care of you here at the hospital and ensure you're okay." The following days were difficult. George underwent exams and treatments in the hospital while trying to process the reality of his situation. He felt trapped in a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, despair. The reality of his granddaughter's betrayal was crushing, and he struggled to maintain hope. After a few days, George's condition stabilized, and the doctors decided he was ready to be discharged. The social worker returned to talk to him about the next steps. "Mr. George, your health is better now, but we need to discuss where you will go. Do you have anyone who can help you?" George shook his head negatively, feeling the weight of loneliness. "I have nowhere to go, no one to help me." She looked at him with concern. "I understand. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to locate your granddaughters. I'll arrange temporary shelter for you. We won't leave you helpless." George thanked her, but the sadness in his heart was palpable. He got up from the hospital bed, feeling fragile and uncertain about the future. Every step he took was a reminder of the betrayal he had suffered. As the social worker headed to her office to request transportation to take George to the shelter, he made an impulsive decision. Determined not to return to the nursing home or go to a shelter, he got up and, without looking back, walked out the front door of the hospital. George walked the streets, feeling lost and hopeless. The betrayal by his granddaughters and the loss of his home weighed heavily on his heart, and he struggled against the sense of despair and loneliness. Each step seemed harder than the last, and he didn't know where to go. As he walked, George spotted a local church. The lights were off, but he felt an inexplicable urge to approach. He stopped at the closed door, his eyes filling with tears. Not knowing what else to do, he knelt on the steps and began to cry out for help. "God, please help me. I'm alone, betrayed by those I trusted most. I have no more strength to go on. My granddaughters abandoned me, sold my house, and now I have nowhere to go. I feel so lost and helpless. Lord, show me a way, a reason to keep fighting. I need a miracle. I need your help now more than ever. Please don't abandon me." In the silence of the night, his words echoed around him, and George felt a brief moment of peace. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw a tall man with a serene appearance coming towards him. "Sir, do you need help?" asked Pastor David, approaching with compassion in his eyes. George, surprised and emotional, nodded. "Yes, I do. I have nowhere to go." Pastor David extended his hand to help George up. "Come with me. Let's talk inside the church." George followed the pastor into the church, feeling a bit more hopeful. They sat on the pews, and George told his story, from his granddaughter's betrayal to his escape from the hospital. Pastor David listened attentively, moved by George's struggle. "This is truly a trial," said Pastor David with an empathetic tone. "But you're not alone. God is with you, and we're here to help." George felt tears streaming down again, this time out of relief. "Thank you, Pastor. I was losing hope." Pastor David smiled gently. "You can stay in the small room at the back of the church. It's not much, but it's a safe place where you can rest." George accepted the offer gratefully. He felt a deep sense of peace being welcomed by the church. "Thank you so much, Pastor. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," said Pastor David. "Here, we help each other, and you can help us too, doing some light chores if you feel up to it." George nodded, determined to give back the kindness he was receiving. In the days that followed, he started helping with cleaning and other light tasks around the church. He felt useful again, and it brought new strength to his life. Each day was a small victory. George found solace in prayers and the simple work he did. He began to feel part of the church community, and the shadows of despair started to fade. Weeks passed since George found refuge in the church, welcomed by Pastor David and the local community. During this time, he regained some of his peace and dignity, feeling more secure and confident. One of the first things he did was transfer all his savings to a secure account with the pastor's help, fearing his granddaughters might try to take the money too. One day, a news report about the church's community work aired on local TV, showing George among the faithful, helping with church activities. Anna and Clara saw the report and decided to go to the church. Arriving at the church, the granddaughters approached George with tears in their eyes. "Grandpa, forgive us. We were selfish," Anna said, trying to sound sincere. George, emotional at seeing his granddaughters, opened his arms and hugged them, feeling a mix of relief and hope. "My girls, I was so worried about you. I thought I'd never see you again." Clara, holding George's hand, said, "We did everything wrong, Grandpa. We should have taken care of you. We missed you so much." George, with tears in his eyes, replied, "I just wanted to understand why you did that. I always thought we could trust each other." Anna lowered her head, looking ashamed. "We made a terrible mistake. We were confused and let greed take over. But we want to make things right, Grandpa." George looked at his granddaughters, trying to see sincerity in their eyes. "You know it was very hard for me. I ended up in the hospital, and I thought I'd never see you again." Clara squeezed George's hand even tighter. "We know, Grandpa. We're so sorry for everything. We want to make amends and take care of you." George, emotional, felt a glimmer of hope. "Do you really want to change? I can't bear another betrayal." Anna wiped away her tears and affirmed, "Yes, Grandpa, we want to be a family again. But what about the money in the account? Is it safe?" The question hit George like a bucket of cold water. He pulled away, looking deeply into his granddaughter's eyes, realizing the truth. The pain of betrayal returned with full force. "You didn't come here for me. You came for the money. How could you?" Anna tried to cover it up, but it was evident their intentions were different. "Grandpa, that's not it. We really are sorry." George, now with firmness and determination, said, "Don't think you can fool me again. I transferred all my money to a secure account. You have no access to anything. Leave and never come back." Pastor David, who had been watching from a distance, approached, ready to support George. "Ladies, it's best if you leave. This is a place of peace, and George doesn't need any more confusion in his life." Anna, realizing their efforts were futile, dried her tears and looked at Clara. "Let's go. There's nothing more we can do here." George, with firmness in his voice, said again, "Leave and never come back. I don't want to see you again." The granddaughters, defeated and with no option, walked away. George watched them leave, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "I wanted it to be different," he murmured to himself. Pastor David placed a comforting hand on George's shoulder. "You did the right thing. Now you can move forward, knowing you're free from their manipulation." George, with a deep sigh, felt lighter. The decision to face his granddaughters and protect his future had been difficult but necessary. He knew that, with the support of the church community, he could finally find peace and rebuild his life. George could hardly believe the audacity of his granddaughters. Frustrated at not getting the money, Anna and Clara decided to take George to court, claiming he was mentally incapable of managing his finances. To make matters worse, they accused Pastor David of taking advantage of George, trying to tarnish the reputation of the only person who had extended a hand to him. The following weeks were a real nightmare for George. He felt betrayed again, now in an even more painful way. The granddaughters were determined to get the money at any cost, and the legal battle promised to be arduous. George spent sleepless nights, worried about what was to come. One day, sitting in the church office, George poured his heart out to Pastor David. "They won't stop until they get what they want," George said, disheartened. His shoulders slumped and his gaze distant. Pastor David, always calm and compassionate, placed a hand on George's shoulder. "We will fight, George. God is on our side, the side of the just. We will face this together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." With Pastor David's help, George found a lawyer willing to assist him. The lawyer, a man of integrity and experience named Michael, who was also a church member, listened attentively to George's entire story and was determined to defend his cause. "George, don't worry. We will prove that you are fully capable of managing your finances and that the accusations against Pastor David are unfounded," Michael assured with conviction. Preparations for the legal battle began. George, though still shaken, felt a new wave of hope seeing Michael's and Pastor David's commitment and dedication. They gathered documents, testimonies, and all necessary evidence to contest the granddaughters' accusations. During a meeting, Michael explained the legal strategy. "We will focus on showing that you were fully in control of your faculties when you transferred the money and that Pastor David never took advantage of you. We have witnesses who can confirm your good mental health and the pastor's selfless help." George, with renewed determination, thanked the lawyer. "Thank you, Michael. I don't know what I would do without you all." The day of the trial arrived. George was nervous but confident, knowing he had people by his side who believed in him. In court, Anna and Clara presented their accusations, but their words were empty, devoid of genuine concern for George's well-being. When it was George's turn to speak, he stood up and with a firm voice declared, "I am here to defend my dignity and my life. My granddaughters betrayed me, sold my house, and now want to make me seem incapable. But I am strong, and with the help of Pastor David and lawyer Michael, I am here to prove it." Michael and Pastor David presented compelling evidence, including testimonies from doctors, church members, and documents showing George's full capacity to manage his finances. The accusations against Pastor David were dismantled one by one, revealing the truth behind the granddaughters' greed. At the end of the trial, the judge delivered his verdict. George was declared fully capable of managing his finances, and the accusations against Pastor David were dismissed. The granddaughters, unable to get what they wanted, lowered their heads and began to cry. George felt his heart ache for them. George, feeling a mixture of relief and emotion, slowly stood up and asked to speak. "Your Honor, if I may, I would like to say something," George requested, his voice firm but laden with emotion. The judge nodded, granting him permission. "You may speak, Mr. George." George took a deep breath, looking around the courtroom, His granddaughters were there, their faces showing defeat and regret. Pastor David and Michael, the lawyer, watched with anticipation. Standing tall and dignified, George began his speech. "I would like to thank God for giving me the strength to overcome this ordeal. In times of great difficulty, I found solace in faith, which guided and sustained me, as it is written in Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." I believe that everything that has happened had a greater purpose, and I am grateful for that. George paused, letting his words resonate in the room. I also want to thank the church community, Pastor David, and lawyer Michael. You were the light that illuminated my path in the darkest moments. Without your help and support, I don't know how I would have managed. He looked directly at his granddaughters, Anna and Clara, and their expressions of regret were unmistakable. And finally, I want to speak directly to my granddaughters. Anna, Clara, I know you are young and have made many mistakes. You betrayed me in ways I never imagined possible. You sold my house, tried to declare me incompetent, and caused me immense pain. George took another deep breath, feeling the emotion in his voice. But, as the word says in Matthew 6:14, "For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you." I choose to forgive you. I will not forget what you did, as it deeply marked my life. However, you are the only family I have left, daughters of my deceased son, and for that reason, despite all the harm you caused, you will always have my love and my goodwill. The room fell silent, absorbing the depth of George's words. Anna and Clara couldn't hold back their tears, realizing the magnitude of the forgiveness they were being given. I hope you can learn from your mistakes and become better people, George continued. May kindness and love guide your steps from now on. There is no place for hatred and resentment in my heart, as I believe love and forgiveness are the greatest forces we can have. The judge watched attentively, visibly impressed by George's dignity and compassion. Very well, Mr. George. Your words are an example of faith and humanity for all of us. With a lighter heart, George returned to his seat. He felt stronger, knowing he had done the right thing. The courtroom began to empty, but the impact of George's speech would echo in the hearts of everyone present for a long time. If George's story touched your heart and you want to hear more incredible tales of resilience and hope, please consider subscribing to our channel. By hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications, you'll never miss out on our latest stories. Share this video with your friends and family to spread the message of hope and love. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue sharing these moving stories. Thank you for being a part of our community. Our